and sort of operational concerns and risk that you might have dealing with this during COVID. And then as we get to the end, sort of some comments on how you might be able to mitigate some of these risks that are popping up that might not be super obvious right out of the gate. And so we'll talk about that as well. We'll be taking questions at basically after the practical and operational concerns portion, and I'll let everyone know when it's question time, as well as at the end. And you can basically just type your questions into the chat, just send it to the host, and it won't show up for anyone else, and then we'll just read it out afterwards, so you don't have to worry about anyone knowing
Absolutely.
who's asking or anything like that.
Yeah, if there are concerns about the privacy from that point of view, you're also welcome to reach out to us via email. As you can see at the bottom, our contact information is included there, and we can have an offline discussion about that. So diving right into it, one thing that I want to talk about before we can get to the meat and potatoes of this discussion, if you will, is just acknowledge the change in complexities around this piece. So there's a lot of focus right now on customer and meeting their needs, but then there's all kinds of other stakeholders that are involved in making sure that your business can run smoothly, especially with the unpredictabilities that we're seeing now in the market. So you might have seen this on the poster for the event as well, the bottom part of the slide. Essentially, that represents various areas within your organization without going into the org chart structure there that play a role. So what we tried to do before this session is on LinkedIn gauge from this different employees, partners, stakeholders point of view, what are some of the things that are top of mind for people? And right away you can see on that poll, safety is number one, right? Especially with us talking about Ontario being in phase 3 now. I'm in North York. I think, Devin, you mentioned that you are close to the Toronto core downtown area, but we're not, I don't think we won't be in phase 3 for the next week or so, but it's a discussion that needs to be had. What do you need to do to be prepared for that discussion? And the second piece below, you can see the item number 3 there, handling of refusal to return. So from an employee point of view, and even from an employer point of view, you might have to have some difficult conversations there, which we'll get into a little bit later. So Devin, anything to add to that slide? Any additional comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not surprising that everyone's main concern is compliance and the legal issues that come up, because it's changing every sinil day, it feels
Mm-hmm.
like. And then dealing with return to work, you mentioned that it could be a difficult conversation. Hopefully, if you take anything away from this, it can be less difficult, but it does need to be sort of a transparent process. And I'll talk about
Right.
that later.
Absolutely. And this is where we dive into what will we be able to cover and what we won't be able to cover today. So Devin.
Yeah, I had to insist on putting this in. It is the obnoxious disclaimer. When you ask questions, I promise that I'm not going to say it depends to everything, but this is all sort of general information, and it shouldn't be taken as legal advice. Everything is unique and has specific issues, so just bear that in mind going forward. By all means, ask your questions. We'll give you some information as much as we can, and if you have more pointed questions, you can always ask us offline, like you mentioned.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So to start the discussion, what I will do is share through chat a link with everyone that allows you to anonymously poll this. We're just wondering, based on the study that McKinsey had shared, this is just from last month, actually middle of last month, um, these are the responses that the organizations shared with McKinsey on a poll. Essentially shows that 78% of the organizations indicated that they have responded appropriately to crisis during wave 1 of COVID. And 80% indicated that the leadership has acted proactively to protect their health and safety. So this included both the employer side of the view, but also employees in some cases. And we're wondering how you feel about this. When you were at your workplaces, or if you put yourself back into March, April timeframe, how were your organizations prepared? So one thing that I'll do is I'll stop sharing and move to the view that takes us to the response view for the poll, and I'll share that with you. So please take a moment to visit that link that I've shared via chat and respond to the poll.
I promise it's anonymous.
Yes, so we're not tracking any information there, and that's part of the reason why we decided to do it via an external website. Okay, so far it looks like people are saying yes, their organization was prepared and appropriately handled the COVID changes. So that's great because based on my experience, there were definitely challenges in my own support that I was providing to the clients. I had to rethink a few things fairly quickly and sometimes even on the fly. If I was providing certain services in person, I had to think about how will I provide those services to them. So now going back to the slides. Okay, so Devin, this is where we dive into the legal considerations for transforming our workplace. Over to you.
My favorite and probably only topic by default. So basically, basically there are three main things we're going to talk about today when you're thinking about sort of what comes into play when you're dealing with a return to work or dealing with COVID-19 and reopening your businesses or adjusting them. The three main areas we're looking at today is going to be sort of occupational health and safety legislation, human rights legislation, as well as sort of employment legislation and related employment issues. The big caveat here is it really depends on the nature of your business
Mhm.
and whether or not you're going to be subject to sort of federal or provincial legislation. And as well, you'll have to keep in mind that there are municipal bylaws now. As an example, Toronto has passed a bylaw dealing with mandatory masks in inside public places. So something to bear in mind. So I won't be going into the nitty gritty of section 1.5 of this says this, and these are all the cases. That's not really what we're going to talk about today. It's just going to be sort of some general information for you. And again, we'll be answering any questions you have in a little bit. So just jot them down or send them in the chat, and that will be helpful because I much prefer responding to questions than or reading off. So if we go on the next slide, we're going to talk about sort of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And yeah, section 1, which I said I wouldn't do, but here we are. So the Occupational Health and Safety Act, dealing with Ontario, there's federal legislation. It is very similar. It deals with sort of safety in the workplace. And when we talk about the workplace, it's actually pretty broadly defined. It's, really any land, premises, location, or thing at or upon and near or which a worker works. So that's a very broad area. And, the duty of an employer under this act is really to make sure you're taking steps to provide a reasonably safe workplace. And so, that's the obligation of the employer. They have to provide a reasonably safe workplace.
Mhm.
Employees have a right to refuse unsafe work. And if they do refuse unsafe work, there is a process where the employer needs to try and address it. And if you can't come to an agreement, you can call in the ministry and they'll make a decision on it. Um, when we're talking about the workplace now, everyone's working from home basically, and does that mean my home is now my workplace, and does my employer have an obligation to inspect my home? We don't really know that because this is all so new that in terms of COVID-19 that there isn't really a lot of case law or tribunal decisions on it. What we sort of know federally is that areas sort of to and from your workplace may not necessarily be covered. We did talk about it was a Canada Post case actually where they talked about whether or not the postal routes that the postmasters walked on, whether they
Mm.
required inspection, and I believe the answer was no, because
Right.
they weren't in the workplace. But generally, when you're making you have this obligation to have a reasonably safe workplace. And we see people taking those precautions as we're opening up. And the biggest thing, and I know it's very tough to do because new information is coming out daily, is following local health recommendations from your local health units, your municipal bylaws like the Toronto mandatory mask, um, and just making sure that you're taking steps and documenting what. And this is sort of the next part, making sure that you're taking steps to appropriately deal with any concerns that come up. And there have been a fair amount of work refusals. I
Mm-hmm.
think there was a Toronto Star article. There was a couple weeks ago about 260-ish had been escalated to the ministry, which means the employer and the
Wow.
employee couldn't sort it out. But I believe only one of them was considered founded. The rest were found, were unfounded. And that's going to vary a lot between, if you are working in a retail, a grocery store like a large chain, or if you're working in an office building, what's reasonable in the circumstances will depend. But overall, the employer's got to take reasonable steps to do that. But it's not you know a burden of perfection, I'd say. If we go on the next slide, um, this sort of deals with human rights legislation, very similar across provinces. I'm going to talk about Ontario because we're in Ontario, and generally speaking, human rights, it's a for the workplace, it's all provincially regulated. There is a federal human rights code that applies to federally regulated industries, so banking, trains, things like that. But for the most part, most people are covered on the Ontario Human Rights Code.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this is interesting because the Ontario Human Rights Code uh, specifically deals with employment and sort of discrimination in employment. And it lists various grounds of discrimination. What the Ontario government has decided that if you make a decision based off of one of these grounds, um, that's improper. So common things: age, race, sex, gender. But for our purposes, the for COVID-19, that's coming up is one, obviously disability, but as well as marital status and family status.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get into that in a second as to why family status matters when you're talking about an employee in the workplace and COVID-19. Um, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which is sort of an advisory body in Ontario, has their policy is that COVID-19 is a disability under the Act. So if you have COVID-19, that would trigger the accommodation uh, obligations under this Act. And the Ontario Human Rights Code is pretty clear. You have every right to equal treatment with respect to employment without discrimination. And under the Ontario Human Rights Code, don't get too caught up on the term employment because it's actually quite broad. It's not just full-time employees. It's anyone who is really working. So full-time, part-time, independent contractor. Those it doesn't matter. It generally applies. So if there is someone has a disability or family status issues or marital status, the employer has an obligation, A, to not discriminate, and B, if this is raised, to provide accommodations to the point of undue hardship.
Right.
And is a really high bar to meet, and arguably perhaps even higher now that work from home has become very common. And so what the duty to accommodate means is you have to take steps to make sure that your employee can continue to work and isn't being discriminated against based off of one of these statuses, so, or protected grounds. So as an example, if someone has COVID-19, you certainly can't fire them right off the bat because they have COVID-19. But an accommodation might be that you can put them on leave, an unpaid leave for a period of time until they're recovered, and then they can return. There are other forms of accommodation, and for the employers in the audience, it's important to know that employees have an obligation to engage in this accommodation process, so that they have to take steps. If an employer says, "How about this?" they can't just say no. They should really have a reason, usually backed up by medical evidence, there is a limit on how much an employer can talk about or ask from an employee. So be careful about that before you start asking employees. But if you've identified an issue, then you sort of work on the accommodation process, and this will sort of come up when we get into the second part about practical considerations. So just go on the next slide. So, yeah, I probably could have
Oh, I
gone to
see.
this.
We've covered this. Yes.
Yeah. So I jumped ahead.
No
The
worries.
third point is dealing with sort of the employment issues that will come up, and I had it under employment legislation previously. And there's lots of different sources of an employer's obligation dealing with employment. Occupational health and safety tends to deal with the not the nature of work, but sort of where the work is happening and the type of work. When I talk about sort of employment standards legislation and other considerations, I'm talking about sort of the laws that govern the actual working relationship. So if you're in Ontario, statistically speaking, you're probably governed by the Employment Standards Act, as well as if you are a non-unionized employee, which again, statistically, you probably are. The contract of employment, those are your two really go-to sources for your the legal rights of the parties, both employers and employees. If you are federally regulated, there's the Canada Labor Code, and if you're unionized, there's often collective agreements. So
Hmm.
some other sources that we don't really talk about too much for today, because most people are in the Ontario, so it's Employment Standards Act, and non-unionized. If you are unionized, you have a collective agreement, and that's essentially your contract of employment.
Yeah. So this
So
is pointing out the different items to watch out for, right? Depending on your situation.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so in Ontario, because lot of what's happening now is workplaces are changing. People have other, they have new duties, old duties are being taken away. We're all now working from home. So things are changing. So whether or not you're allowed to do this, really the starting point is the contract of employment. Every employment relationship in Ontario has one. Whether or not it's written down is one thing.
Hmm.
Not written down, it still exists. But then the law and lawyers like me get to come up with these terms that just get put into it. But that is your starting point. So you should have a contract of a written one if you have.
Right.
What That's your starting point, and then it's sort of informed by the relevant employment legislation that's out there. So like the Employment Standards Act, it's in the background and basically creates like a floor for the rights and obligations of employers and employees, because it is a two-way street. It's really a two-way contract. So as I mentioned, lots of other sources, but Employment Standards Act is sort of the main one for Ontario, and that sets the basic, you know, basic rights of employers and employees. And it's important to note, and this came up a lot when the layoffs first started happening, is just because you have a potential right under the Employment Standards Act for a layoff, as an example, you want to go back to the contract to see if the contract actually lets you do that.
Hmm.
So the contract is always the starting point. So, so again, the main focus for when it comes to employment standards legislation, that the main fight, for lack of a better term, is always about these obligations upon layoffs or terminations and things like that. And that's really what's been triggered recently because of the disruption to the economy with COVID-19. So, and we'll get into that as we move on to the next slide.
Yep. Practical and operational concerns.
Yeah. So this is sort of the second set. So what we sort of know from the first part, which I appreciate is a very high level view because we're only here for a little bit, is you've got to employers have to make sure the workplace is safe. The employees have a right to refuse, but they have to talk about it. Employers have the obligation to make sure that they are not discriminating based off of protected ground, And at the same time, employees have an obligation to engage with the accommodation process. And then ultimately, you have legal obligations for the employment relationship that you need to make sure you're not losing sight of in this barrage of new information. And I don't want to say panic, because I think we've sort of moved beyond that, but this barrage of new information and sort of uncertainty as to what the right moves are. And so that's what we're going to talk about in this next section, is sort of some practical concerns that you need to think about going forward, both as an employer decision maker or even as an employee. And so, when we're talking about this section, I'm mostly speaking from an employment law perspective, because that's my job here today. And so when the COVID-19 first happened and the state of emergency was declared in March, most cases, one of two things happened. Either you were able to shift your operations to a work from home setting, which was great for some people. My firm was paperless and cloud-based to begin with, so it was very easy to just pick up and work from my living room. It was difficult for others. But the other scenario, especially for maybe retail or restaurants or gyms, is that a portion of your workforce was temporarily laid off, was sort of the starting point. So the first point here is I want to talk about returns to work after a layoff. And so this is directed at returns to work when you're now recalling employees, or you're an employee who's being recalled. And so it's important to know that, I'm sure there's been lots of blogs about it, I've written about it myself, that there was some issues about whether or not layoffs could happen under the contract of employment. The Ontario government has put in some regulations relatively recently that is, it's very technical, but is basically tried to make it so that layoffs do not result in an automatic termination. Because if someone is terminated in Ontario, they're usually owed sort of a reasonable notice, or at least some sort of severance pay, although that's a legal term. So when you're dealing with sort of the return to work, you have to look back at the legal issues we talked about. So, all right, you are a gym that has been closed for 3 months. You have to consider your occupational health and safety requirements. So have you provided a reasonably safe workplace for your employees? When you are asking people to return to work, you need to make sure you're not sort of involuntarily discriminating against them, or unintentionally discriminating against them due to a disability or a family status. And what I mean by that is, if someone has an underlying health condition that makes them a higher risk of having significant issues from COVID-19, that might trigger an accommodation process under the code. And so it's something to be aware of when an employee sort of refuses to return. You want to know why. Same with family status. If you have someone in your home who is vulnerable, your employee might say, look, I can't return to the workforce because if I do, I might end up exposing my spouse or my child who has a condition to COVID-19. And again, that might trigger an obligation to accommodate under family status. And so that's why that's important. And in terms of dealing with, I guess, a continued work from home versus returning to the office, that's a form of accommodation. There's lots of us we've been working from home. Eventually, we'll return to the office. Some of us may want to do that, again, because I want to talk to my coworkers. I like seeing people, but some people may not, because of these concerns we sort of raised. And a consideration for this is, how much are you changing someone's job duties? If someone did A before COVID-19, and because of how your business has altered as a result of COVID-19, maybe they now do B, you have to make sure that your contract allows them to change, the employer allows them to change that job. And the easiest way to do this is, again, open communication, transparency. It's a tough time for everyone. I find, you get more flies with honey than vinegar, or is it bees? I don't know. The final, yeah, it's both. Yeah. The final bit is talking about workforce attrition or retention. So things are very different in the last 4 months. Places have shuttered. Workforces have learned to adapt and maybe don't need as many people, or they don't need people doing the same things they used to do before. Maybe you've gone paperless, so you don't necessarily need that person who's photocopying everything every day. And so you have to be aware of if you're changing job duties or you're letting people go as a result of there being no more work for them. You have to go back to these legal considerations I talked about before, to make sure that they don't play a role. So, if someone has a disability and they can't come into the office, and you say, well, if you can't come into the office, we have no work for you, that
Hmm.
is a significant concern for an employer, in terms of legal exposure. The same is sort of said when you're thinking maybe we don't need this many people anymore. We've become much more streamlined and lean. How do you sort of have people transition out of the workforce? And in Ontario, there are fairly significant protections for employees, built into either sort of the general common law, those terms that I talked about before, or even in contracts of employment, that have some specific requirements for when you are letting someone go, or you are being let go. And again, I advise employer clients, I advise employee clients as well. I personally say, never send the form letter. It has to be a little something personal, because people will
Right.
be upset by it, and then that causes sort of additional exposures. And that's always dictated by the contract, like I mentioned, as well as legislation. So you want to be thinking about that as things go on.
Yeah, the human touch, right, from that point of view.
Yeah, and that basically brings me to sort of the end of the practical considerations of just making sure you're following policies and procedures in terms of local health networks and what they recommend.
Yeah.
Make sure that you're complying with your own contracts and you're not sort of inadvertently discriminating against people as a result of perfectly legitimate, justifiable needs, but there is sort of a legal framework around that you need to be aware of. And
Right.
so there'll be time for questions if you have them.
Yeah, so I'll open it up for questions. I'm not seeing any in the chat, but if you guys would like to unmute yourself and ask a question, you're welcome to do so at this point.
I don't want to say I promise it won't be. It depends, but now's your chance.
Good try. So while others are thinking of a question, one of the questions that I've been wondering, Devin, is a lot of the tech companies have announced that they're actually going to be office-less, right, as much as possible. I don't think we can ever be 100% office-less because we'll have data centers and all these different assets that require that in-person care. But going out of that traditional quote unquote office environment, is there a different set of laws that would apply if they're going officeless? Or would that be a challenge for the policymakers and people like yourself to stand up for employees that are now permanently working from home, whether they want
So
to or not?
that's an interesting question, because it depends on sort of what lens you're looking at it through. So occupational health and safety, like I mentioned, does your home become your workplace? And that's sort of unclear. I think if that was your sole workplace, things like the Occupational Health and Safety Act may apply. Uh,
Hmm.
Things change over time, but something I always think about is on the employment contract side of things. Work from home has traditionally been considered a bit of a perk.
Right.
People like to work from home. It was a bonus, essentially. Now, if we're switching to work from home all the time, you know, you might have to have a discussion with your employees to make sure that that is something that you're allowed to do in your contract. Um,
Hmm.
and I know employment contracts that I've drafted, they say your workplace is going to be here.
Right.
Sometimes there is travel, and so you might end up with an employee saying, "Well, I don't want to work from home all the time. You're sort of downloading all of the infrastructure requirements onto me."
Hmm.
Difficult. And so you want to make sure that's something you're allowed to do. And again, it's about sort of open communication and moving
Right.
forward with your employees.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've seen with the quote unquote permanent employees, as they're considered, with some of my clients, they actually provided a bonus, if you will, um, due to COVID to the employees that are working from home, because you may not have, as you mentioned, that infrastructure, right? You may not have an ergonomic chair, you may not have a mouse, you may not have a keyboard that can support that.
Yeah.
If you're required to stare at a screen all day long with a laptop, maybe you require a monitor. So that way, yes, the onus is on employee to decide what infrastructure they need, but here's X amount of money. And one of the things that I was wondering is how do they decide what amount of money is enough to be able to do that, right? Because different places might have different inflation,
Mhm.
so on and
Yeah.
so forth.
Yeah, that's a business decision, right?
Yeah,
In terms of a legal issue, if someone says, I have a terrible herniated disc in my back and I can't work in the office, the wooden chair that I currently have in my living room, then the employer's obligation to maybe provide some funds to help with
right.
this is probably greater than someone who's just like, I don't like my current chair. Can I get something new?
Yes,
So
agreed. So
that would
the
always.
some interesting discussions outside of even legal conversations, right? Negotiations that employees may have to now have with the employers, which they may not have had before. Um, so I'll go back to the slides. I haven't seen any other questions, but again, feel free to message us on the chat if you are interested in asking any additional questions. So one of the things that I've noticed, the slide that you're seeing right now, it's a study that was again completed by McKinsey, the same one that we shared with you earlier, actually. This chart breaks it down into not just from a skill point of view, but different situations or different demographics of the overall workforce that may be in place. So as an example, this is showing you for each group, if you divided it up into, let's say, one group and the other group on each factor level, then are they impacted positively by going remote? What is their engagement level? What is the overall impact to their positive well-being? So there's some quite interesting data. There's a lot of information on this chart, but a couple things that we wanted to point out to you. One of the things is, Devin, you and I were discussing this earlier, the male versus the female piece, the second last piece that you see on the slide there. The positive work effectiveness for male is 79.4%, whereas for female, it's 37%. So it's quite interesting to note those differences. And it would be quite interesting to see how, from a legal standpoint, that risk or that, I guess, the position that that particular demographic is in, how that factors in when some of these legislations, I should say, are created, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I'll jump in really quick before
Yeah.
let you go on. Like that would be sort of a, and we know this, it's been in the news a lot. Like that's a red flag in terms of
Hmm.
family status. Why are women who probably historically have had to, and not historically, continue to have the burden of what are generally considered domestic chores and things like that, this, uncredited work, which is really work.
Hmm.
Um, why are they responding so much lower than men? And I suspect it's because things haven't changed as much as we would like them to.
Right.
There was a study out previously about academia where male academics have felt that the submissions of male academics for publishing have gone way up since COVID-19, but for women,
Hmm.
it's gone way down. And
Right.
again, because of these, sort of these, unpaid labor considerations that have really come in and probably are still there and are a real issue.
That's true. And the perceptions with dependence as well, right? Which is the previous category. And this is something else that Devin and I were discussing on this chart earlier. And we have a suspicion that the labels are probably switched on that one. Because I would expect people with dependence to be having 19.8% of the positive work effectiveness because of the extra duties that they now have with the dependents, as
Mhm.
opposed to without dependents who might not be as impacted by it. So that's quite an interesting metric as well. But what this is pointing out is that even if you look at it from a skill or a stakeholder point of view, you might say, let's say my employees versus my quote unquote contractors. How am I going to deal with that one demographic versus the other? You need to break it down even further and think about what is that specific individual or group's further factors that are impacting them. Are they male or female? Are they with dependence or without dependence? Are they non-remote workers or are they remote workers? So from that point of view, we dive right into the next piece of the presentation, which is mitigating the unexpected risks.
Great. So it's me again. So when I talk about mitigating unexpected risks, a big thing is if you're part of a larger organization, and I mean like quite large, you probably have a risk management department that's been working day and night since March to deal with this. So if you haven't spoken to your risk management department, maybe you should go, if you're a decision maker, go check it out. They probably have tons of information for you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's hard to say, how do you mitigate the unexpected? You don't know what you don't know. But some of the obvious ones that we've talked about and we all think about is sort of your actual business in terms of you know the business and the commerce, and whether or not you're getting people through the door. That's the easy risk that you think of in terms of like, how is it going to impact me? But because I'm a lawyer, I think about all these other risks that you have uh, in terms of not just relating to COVID or your work shutting down, but in terms of continuing to work or changing your workplace during this time. And some of the two big ones that we sort of expect to see is litigation coming from really employees in terms of all these workplace changes. We've definitely started seeing more concerns from the cyber and privacy side of
Right.
things. They're working from home. They don't have a lot of infrastructure, so they're more likely to be caught by scams. I think the reports are like a 400%
Oh
increase.
gosh, yeah, I was going to say actually, just a quick little personal story. I've been receiving emails, and I guess one of them got through my spam filters. It almost felt like someone you knew sent you that email. And
Mhm.
the subject line of that email was an old password for that particular email, which caught me off guard.
Mhm.
So it's be very mindful of someone who's trying to interact with you through Bitcoin and things of that nature,
Yeah.
because there's a very high possibility that that is a scam. And be mindful of the phone calls, right? From that perspective as well, there's a very sharp rise in those as well. For those of you that are in Canada, there's actually a Canada do not call list where you can register your number. And that should significantly reduce the amount of marketing type phone calls you get in the first place. But it's not foolproof, as I've learned over the last couple months.
Yeah. If the duct cleaners keep calling me and I just tell them I don't have any
Oh
ducts.
gosh, they called me twice this morning.
Yeah. So, um, and so dealing with that, how do you sort of deal with these risks?
Mhm.
So increases in cyber, your employees, lawsuits for wrongful dismissal or discrimination, or regulatory complaints because of an unsafe workplace. There's a couple of ways that you can sort of manage this risk, and it's really going to depend on how big it is
Mhm.
and how many resources you want to put in. Because often what we talk about, I should say, I also have a designation as a risk manager, an ARM. So I think about this at times. Is you always want to think about it's the severity of the risk as well as the severity as well as the likelihood of
Mhm.
it. So something that's unlikely and pretty small, maybe you don't have to do much.
Right.
But if something is unlikely, but really, really severe, maybe you have to think about addressing that risk. And so that kind of leads into what I talk about risk transfer, which is basically you've identified what your issue is, and this requires you to sort of sit down and maybe have a little bit of a workshop with your group and figure out what your main risks are, and then figuring out how to get rid of them if you can. So risk transfer, it's usually insurance. I'm an insurance litigation lawyer, so that's what I think about, and that's saved for sort of the bigger issues. And there's going to be lots of claims for COVID adjacent things. So
Right.
cyber liability and employment claims are going to be big. There is insurance for that. For insurance companies under your directors and officers or an employment practices liability policy, you can often make a claim to your insurance company, usually to pay defense costs. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so I mean that's some. So dealing with employment risks, your wrongful dismissal claims, your harassment claims, discrimination, things like that. That's a sort of insurance component that does exist. Same with cyber liability because it can be catastrophic to a workplace that there is cyber liability insurance out there as well. Another form of sort of transfer. And basically, you're giving this risk away. You're basically saying, insurance company, I'm going to pay you a premium, and then you're going to deal with the mess if it happens, subject to the policy terms. Waivers are sort of another way. There's probably been popping up in the news a lot. Waivers are a contractual way to transfer risk. Basically, someone comes into your gym, and maybe you have them sign a waiver saying, if you get COVID-19 here, you can't sue me. Whether or
Right.
not a waiver is going to be effective is really depends on the situation, because courts don't always like them, but they do work if they're implemented properly. And then finally, when I talk about transfer, there's also just contractual risk transfer. That's when you have contracts with your vendors. Who's cleaning your office, who's doing your IT work. When you have that sort of service agreement, is there something in that contract that says, if you make a mistake, and we get sued, you have to take care of it for us. And then so
Right.
you can put clauses like that in there, properly drafted and all that. And so that's one way of transferring your risk. Um, and then finally, there's treating your risk or risk treatment. Basically, something is left over, and how do you deal with that? You can never you can never transfer it all, right? Because policies have deductibles, or the law won't let you contract out of something. And because I do employment work and I deal with people, the biggest thing is having policies in place, and they don't have to be big and complicated and long. They sort of have to fit your business, because people are sort of your weakest and your strongest element. So
Mm-hmm.
having policies in place that are communicated by people, understood, and then properly enforced will go a really long way into avoiding risks altogether, if you can. So, if people have good password hygiene, so they're not making their password 1 2 3 4, they're making
Right.
it 8 characters with upper and lower case. That's a policy you can implement, and that will make a huge difference in your cyber risk. Same with workplace policies and harassment, as an example. Those are actually mandatory in Ontario now, but people understanding what their obligations are and how to act accordingly will again reduce your risk of having this happen and avoid your risk, if possible, of having this happen. And so ultimately, you want to have these policies, and you want to review your current contracts, especially contracts of employment, if things are changing, to make sure that they match the current reality of your business. I've had clients on both sides of employee-employer fights where they've been there for 19 years and they have a
Mm-hmm.
contract and they're now an executive, and they started as a bus boy, and the only
Wow.
written contract they have is a busboy contract, as an example. So you have to make sure you're updating things as you go. And so again, having policies and making sure your contracts are up to date is a really good way of dealing with that, for
Absolutely.
treatment. And that basically wraps up my bit.
Yeah, so if you, I don't think we'll have time for another poll, so if you don't mind, I'll skip that and go straight to questions. If there are any questions at this time, you're welcome to ask. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions.
So while we wait for some questions, come on, you can always ask. What are some of the concerns you're seeing your clients focus on these days?
Yeah, so some of the concerns that I'm seeing are actually shift in duties, to be frank, because I work in transformations area. So what that means is some people have had to take on additional roles, if you will, as part of their jobs, right? Some people that maybe did not have managerial duties earlier are now being asked to play those roles. And one of the challenges is, first of all, a little bit of a lack of confidence on the part of the individual who's receiving these duties because they haven't played those roles before. And secondly, a little bit of hesitation in playing these while everybody's remote, right? Because certain cultures were very, very dependent on people interaction. So that's something that I've seen. I don't really deal with the legality of it too much, but some of the requests that have come my way, obviously, being part of the transformation team, have been more BCP, business continuity planning related as well. So at the start of COVID, when things shifted, the focus became operations, right? Keeping lights on, and it was all hands on deck. So for retailers, that would have meant certain people having to leave office, maybe even leave their workplaces at quote unquote home, right? The remote office, and go into the store and support. So there were pictures I saw online actually with CEOs of Loblaws, Longo, some of those companies going in and providing a helping hand, right? So that I think was an interesting conversation that affected my work directly. But because I work as a consultant, to be honest, the things that employees might be dealing with, those didn't impact me personally as much. But from the poll that we saw earlier, safety is definitely number one concern for everyone. If one of my clients asked me to go into the office today, I would definitely ask that question. What are the policies in place? Should I bring my own mask or are you providing one? So on and so forth. The second part of that would be, once I'm in the office, what behavior should I exhibit? So if I have to go and see a coworker who's maybe sitting currently 20 feet away from me, and usually I would go and have conversations with them. What should I do in this case? So it's all the little things in your routine that you deal with. What should I do with those now? That's kind of what my questions to my clients at this point would be. But
Yeah.
luckily, my clients have been very supportive, and I've been working remotely. Yeah. So I'm not seeing a lot of questions at this point, but what I'll do is share my screen. Oh, there is one question. So if you don't mind staying a bit later than usual, um, there's a question. There are many companies becoming more lean during these days. This results in some layoffs and at the same time, new hirings. What's your recommendation regarding the communication to employees who are waiting for a legal process and reduce the uncertainty? It's a great question.
All right. So not entirely sure what you mean by legal process, but a big thing for, well, both employers and employees. So for employers, if you're letting people go, but you're also hiring new people, if possible, you can always say, look, this position doesn't exist anymore, but there is this new position that maybe they're qualified, maybe they're not. I mean, it
Right.
will always depend. And you could potentially try and bridge them in that way, which is one way of dealing with things. And from the employee side of things, that might be, they have an obligation to mitigate their losses. So if you are laid off, permanently, which is so dismissed rather than a temporary layoff, if you are dismissed permanently, you have an obligation to go find another job. And
Hmm.
if you don't take that seriously, and maybe you decide that you weren't paid enough upon termination, that can be something that will be held against the employee. When for employers, it's a tough time for everyone.
Hmm.
I think, because I have a couple of recent new files from the employee side of things, and one of the biggest issues there is, they got a layoff notice, a couple months ago, and either they haven't heard anything, or they or they then get like another letter saying they're dismissed.
Right.
um, just open check in with people, give them an update saying, hey, we know you still exist. Employees are allowed to ask what's going on, because that will also help with the uncertainty. If you're on a temporary layoff, you can ask your employer,
Hmm.
what are the plans? When am I coming back?
Right.
And the employer might have a good answer for you. So it's always good if you're an employee to take the initiative and get the information, because that will help reduce your uncertainty. And if you're an employer, provide that information if you can. I mean, everything is up in the air,
Right.
but that would hopefully answer some of the questions. If you're wondering, if someone's waiting to decide whether or not to sue their employer, get legal advice specifically, because there is a lot of new sort of regulations that have come in that's made things very complicated.
I can
Uh,
imagine.
Many other employment lawyers are all sort of scratching their heads and trying to figure out what's going on. So, you know, the biggest thing is just, check in frequently.
Right.
Once is probably fine.
Yeah, actually, one other thing that I can comment on towards that, the situation that you described, Savich, who asked that question, sounds very similar to when an organization goes through a reorganization, right? So they might be eliminating certain positions, but they might also be creating some new positions to support skill set that they didn't have before. So one of the things you can do is to try and figure out how do they typically dealt with those situations in past? How were those situations dealt with? Is there a precursor to this? The other thing that comes into play there is the relationship, as you pointed out, Devin, right? Keeping in touch. Now, there's certain conversations, if the good relationship is good with your immediate manager or with HR, there's certain things you can ask openly, and there's certain things that you may have to think about. So be mindful and keep in touch with your coworkers as well, right? It's always good to know what's happening across the pond. With caution, obviously, you don't want to be saying, hey, I know you did something differently for this person or another, but be very mindful of that.
Yeah, and consistent messaging is really important. I should throw that in as
Yeah,
well. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
for
So be
most of
mindful. So Savish, does that answer your question? Feel free to unmute yourself if you would like any additional clarifications. Yep. So they thank us for their comments. So I know we're over time, but if we can stay a couple more minutes, Devin, if you don't mind. Are there any additional questions? I noticed that we have a new joiner there as well. If there are any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask those questions now.
and I believe this is going to be recorded, or is recorded and being
Yes,
put up.
yeah. So be mindful of that. If you would like your questions to be anonymous, you're welcome to share those with me, the host, or you're welcome to, I'll share my screen again. And that way you'd be able to see the contact information for Devin if you are interested in reaching out to him specifically for any legal advice.
Yeah, and that is my Twitter account on the side there. It's 50% legal information and 50% just
Coffee
silly fun.
shops.
So whatever you want. But yeah, by all means, reach out to anyone, and if you have questions, let us know. I think the slides will go around before at some point after this. But yeah, that's
Absolutely. Yeah, we will make sure that the slides are made available and an email goes out with the link to those. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your lunch hour with us, everyone. And thank you, Devin, for joining and sharing this very valuable information with us. As
that'd
we
be
go into phase 3 for Ontario, I hope everyone stays safe. And we look forward to hearing you and how your journey has been.
great.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Bye, everyone.